I certainly love making my movie lists each year as much as the next YouTuber, but I want to do something new this year. I will still make sure to talk about my favorite and least favorite movies of the past year, but to be consistent with how I committed myself to talking more frequently about video games on this channel, I also want to commemorate the games I played in 2020, so that is what I am here to talk about today. I didn't specifically want to make a top 10 best or worst games of 2020 list, and that is primarily due to the fact that I don't have the time, money, or energy to play every game that releases in a given year. I have to be selective with the games I buy and play, and I also have an unholy backlog of games, so when I wasn't spending time going through a new release last year, I was working on something in my collection. So because of that, I thought it would suffice to simply rank all of the games I played for the first time from worst to best. Bear in mind that even though some games I reviewed this year may have gotten higher scores than others, this list is based completely on my subjective opinions, so some games might be ranked lower despite receiving higher scores in my reviews. It's my list after all, so I can do whatever I want with it. With that being said, let's get into this, shall we? Starting us off at number 23 is Good Job. The timing of this idiosyncratic Switch exclusives release couldn't have been better because I was laid off from my previous job due to COVID at around this same time. Therefore, the idea of playing as a guy who could destroy entire office spaces in order to solve workplace-style puzzles seemed wonderfully cathartic. At first, it was, especially since it allowed for couch co-op that resulted in extra hilarity. But the longer the game went on, it not only got more difficult, as a game naturally should, but it became more difficult through frustrating game design rather than tough but fair challenges. The tasks that the game threw at me in its later levels just became cumbersome and were no longer fun to play. Once the game became overwhelmingly tedious because of its design choices and the annoying controls, I lost all motivation to finish it. Good Job is ultimately an example of a strong concept that was unfortunately wasted. Number 22, Bendy and the Ink Machine. This game has a pretty dedicated cult following from its fan base, and for the life of me, I cannot understand why. There are some cool ideas on display in this first-person horror game, primarily the fact that evil cartoon characters come to life in a dilapidated animation studio, and you can learn more about the sinister backstory through chilling audio recordings. But I was never really impressed by how these ideas were translated to gameplay, given that the controls were clunky, the scares were predictable, and the story often left me with more questions than answers. That wasn't helped by the ending, which, to me, felt completely anticlimactic, despite the intense final boss fight. If this could have been refined into something with more engaging gameplay and satisfying story elements, I would have been more positive on this one like so many others are. Number 21, Star Wars Squadrons. The game that I most recently reviewed on my channel, this is yet another Star Wars game disappointment from EA. I had mentioned in that video that I was hoping for something more in common with the Rogue Squadron games from the late 90s and early 2000s, and in some ways, it recreated those experiences and even improved on them by providing what is the most immersive Star Wars flight simulator yet. The core mechanics of this game are actually really solid, and the multiplayer is enjoyable. What I found lackluster about the game, though, is that the single-player campaign is completely monotonous and boring. The story is so empty and devoid of any depth that it makes all of the missions feel emotionally disjointed from the player, ultimately adding up to a repetitive series of scenarios without personality. The game is merely half of a worthy experience, where the single-player mode is borderline worthless, and the multiplayer is fun, but not really worth the monetary investment. What a shame. Number 20, SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated. Having gotten 100% completion on Battle for Bikini Bottom for the original Xbox back in 2005, the news of an enhanced remake was, as the Senate put it,
a surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
And with that, it's both a blessing and a curse that the remake is a one-by-one translation of that original game. For one thing, this means that the game is exactly what one would expect and hope for, that being that nothing is changed from the original except for the visual upgrade. Anyone who enjoyed this collectathon platformer in its original state will not be disappointed by its translation to HD. However, this also means that all of the design flaws of that original game were left unchanged, so even though the things that weren't broken weren't fixed, the stuff that was broken wasn't fixed either, primarily with issues relating to frustrating level design. To make matters worse, I played the Nintendo Switch version of this game, which was played with technical problems such as frame rate dips, occasional glitches, and muddy textures. While I wouldn't consider this a bad game whatsoever, considering that I had fun with it for nostalgic reasons and as a fan of SpongeBob in general, it certainly hasn't aged that well. Number 19, The Last of Us Part 2. The hatred for this game has reached truly hyperbolic and absurd heights, but I won't be the first or the last to admit that this was a significant significant disappointment. And for me, it's not for the fact that the story doesn't measure up to the original. In fact, if certain beats of the story had been presented in a different order or pace, I would have been completely fine with this story. But the fact of the matter is that the game was ruined by its pacing, for the overabundance of flashbacks, obscenely long levels, and the choice to have you play 10 plus hours as Ellie only to switch over to Abby for another 10 to 5 hours was really frustrating. These design choices made an already depressing narrative tough to deal with. But beyond that, Naughty Dog otherwise made a solid game, for all of the other elements necessary to capitalize on the original game's success were there, particularly in that the core gameplay, voice acting, graphics, and music had all been improved. If only the story could have been structured much better, for then it could have been a masterpiece worthy of the game that preceded it. Number 18, Spyro Reignited Trilogy. Growing up, I was a Nintendo boy, and my wife grew up in a PlayStation family. Therefore, the video games of our marriage thus far have been defined by new experiences we've shared for the first time together, and then going back and forth showing each other Nintendo or PlayStation games from our childhoods. The Spyro Reignited Trilogy was my wife taking a turn and showing me such a childhood game, and for the most part, we had a lot of fun breezing through the grand total of 35 to 40 hours that consists of this enhanced remake of Insomniac's original Spyro games. There was a nice variety in the levels, and I thought that it was unique to play a platformer where it's not so much about jumping from one place to the next, but rather gliding, dashing, and breathing fire on your enemies. I suppose the reason why the Spyro trilogy was not as high in my estimation is that the controls were not always smooth, and for me, a platformer lives and breathes from its level design, but most especially its controls. On top of that, the game never felt that challenging in the true sense of the word, for it mostly amounted to just obtaining a bunch of gems and other random collectibles, leading up to lackluster boss fights and gameplay that's accompanied by generic music overall. At this point, I think the 3D Mario games have simply ruined all other 3D platformers for me, but of those I have played in my lifetime, the Spyro games are among the better ones of Mario's competitors. Number 17, Moving Out. My wife, her siblings, and I are fond of playing goofy multiplayer games together, especially when they're centered on co-op play. That is why we were quickly taken by the idea of Moving Out, which tasks up to 4 players to work as a team in a hilariously incompetent moving company. Think Overcooked, but you're moving boxes, furniture, and knickknacks out of buildings instead of running a kitchen. What makes the gameplay interesting is that you have to strategize when and how to move certain objects, and then you also have to carefully consider how to put these things inside the moving truck so that they don't topple and fall out. We all had a lot of fun both for the hilarity that ensued from the gameplay itself, on top of other wacky elements present in the creative levels that never felt like a repeat of the previous one. Like the other games that I've mentioned on this list already though, it loses points for me due to the fact that not every single one of those levels is a winner. In fact, some of them cause some serious contention and stress between us, and more so because of the cumbersome level design as opposed to who we are as people. This extends into the challenges offered in each level, for the incentives to get the high scores or in-game rewards for peak performance were so low that we would usually just beat a level and move on, without so much of a reason to ever go back and beat them due to the frankly ridiculous parameters the game set for full completion. Still, Moving Out was a very fun experience while it lasted, and if you're looking for something truly unique for couch co-op, this'll do the trick. Number 16, Donut County. Every game that I mention from here on out is one that I can confidently say that I liked, and Donut County is no exception. I can honestly say that I've never played a game like this one, for it takes an assortment of characters that you might expect to find in an Animal Crossing game, but instead of a wholesome life simulation, it puts them in something much different but uniquely exciting. A game where holes just appear in the ground, and as they move around, they consume everything in their path and steadily get bigger as the level progresses. For the sake of spoilers, I won't provide context for why these holes pop up, but let's just say that I was honestly surprised by the thought that was put into the story and its themes about the importance of community. It also helps that the game is fun in a strange but refreshing kind of way, and there was hardly a dull moment to be had. The only downside though is that the game is unfortunately short, and once it's beaten over the course of a roughly 2-hour playthrough, there are few incentives to go back through it again. But I would still recommend it thoroughly, because even though it is short, the experience is fun, distinctive, and even thought-provoking. Number 15, A Short Hike. My thoughts on A Short Hike are mostly similar to that of the game I just talked about. For one thing, there are once again somewhat anthropomorphic animals that can think and speak for themselves, and as the name suggests, a short hike is short. I started playing it on a whim on a Sunday morning a few months ago, and I was done with it within an hour or so. But even so, I rank it just barely higher than Donut County due to its sincerity and calming nature. More than any other game I played in 2020, A Short Hike was just a pleasant experience, and left me to freely explore the small but pretty world I was given around to play with. The story is predictable but affecting, the humor was lighthearted and fun, and the gameplay was effective in its simplicity. Check this one out if you want a break from stress and pain, for this will indeed provide a brief but needed respite. Number 14, Spider-Man Miles Morales. Originally I wanted to make a full review of this game, but after I came to the conclusion that I didn't have much of my own unique commentary to add to the conversation, I decided against making that video. Instead, what I will say is that Miles Morales provides more of what Insomniac's first Spider-Man game provided for us in 2018, and considering that is indeed a very good game, this one is too. As a whole, this package is weaker than the original, and not necessarily because the campaign is shorter. It's more so because the story felt less personal and more plot-driven in a predictable way, and most of the scripted character interactions didn't feel quite as genuine as I would have hoped. Story-wise, this game underwhelmed me, but Miles Morales completely works otherwise because it successfully builds on what made its predecessor great, and applied it in such a way that playing as Miles feels familiar but also unique to his personality. Combat, web-slinging, and completing missions was as fun as it was before, and the suits were tripped out. I was ultimately happy with how this turned out, and I look forward to the bright future of this series. Number 13, the remake of The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. This is my favorite video game franchise of all time, so I am always eager to play a new, or in this case remade, installment in the series. And while I would probably consider Link's Awakening to be a mid-tier Zelda game after having completed it, that doesn't take away from how much I genuinely enjoyed it. Nintendo took what was already a very idiosyncratic Zelda narrative and made it even more special by applying this kawaii, toy-like art style to all of the characters, in an attempt to translate a Game Boy game into what would make sense for a modern Switch title. I thought it worked quite well and makes for a game that is equally fun from an artistic standpoint as well as gameplay. In a typical Zelda game fashion, the puzzles are creative, the dungeons are memorable, and there is much joy to be had in unraveling the many mysteries of Koholint Island through its side quests and minigames. I still strongly prefer the 3D Zelda games since they have provided a much more dynamic experience in terms of gameplay and storytelling, but I'm still grateful I got to experience this enhanced version of a classic game. I would be more than happy to play remakes of A Link to the Past, The Minish Cap, or other top-down Zelda games if they were remade in a similar fashion. Number 12, Overcooked II. I had mentioned Overcooked earlier when talking about moving out, and I made that comparison because the original Overcooked game is one that I spent many hours on with my wife and her brothers. However, with that co-op restaurant kitchen simulator, we eventually got so frustrated by some of the late game levels that we gave up on finishing it. All of that strife from our experience with the first Overcooked prepared us for the sequel though, which not only did we completely finish, but also found to be a much better and more streamlined experience. For one thing, subtle but very meaningful tweaks with the game mechanics made gameplay much smoother, such as fine-tuning the movement of the player characters, and the ability to throw ingredients across the kitchen made a huge difference in saving time and energy we spent on getting meals prepared. The developers also did a much better job designing the levels, for even though they still provided a suitable challenge, they were designed in such a way that at least after a couple of tries, we were able to make a successful game plan that ultimately scored us 2 or 3 stars in every single level. Even though the game may not have gotten easier, so to speak, the development team did a better job at making the end goal attainable without making you cuss out or physically abuse the player sitting next to you. If you found the original game to be a maddening ordeal, give Overcooked 2 a try, for you may be surprised by how much more fun you'll have this time around. Number 11, Abzu. If you want to play a game to relax, Abzu should be at the forefront of your mind. Although it can be beaten in a matter of 3 to 4 hours, the traditional objective of playing the game from beginning to end isn't really what Abzu is about. Rather, what you're asked to do is take control of a diver that is swimming through incredibly beautiful oceanic environments, and then allow the immersive visuals and music to overcome you. From what I can tell, the intended effect of this minimalistic underwater adventure is to absorb the scenery, interact with the sea life, and submit to the therapeutic qualities harbored by the amazing sights and sounds. What I got out of doing those exact things was peace and calmness that I rarely find from popular media, and it was akin to a digital form of meditation. I may or may not be overhyping this, especially since it is a short-lived experience, but the fluid controls and effective audio-visual presentation are not to be ignored. Find yourself a good set of headphones, lay comfortably on your couch with a blanket wrapped around your torso, and let this game wash over you.
Pun intended.
Number 10, Shovel Knight King of Cards. In this final installment of the 4 interconnected campaigns that constitute the Shovel Knight treasure trove, King of Cards provides a lot of the same fun that the previous 3 campaigns did. The talented folks at Yacht Club Games seem to have shown the most improvement for this chapter of the game in terms of world building, progression, storytelling, and core gameplay, for all of these elements feel completely fresh and new despite being in a mostly familiar setting. It helps that this game features perhaps the best assortment of levels out of all the 4 campaigns, for they're shorter, but the greater amount of levels per area allowed for more enjoyable bursts of fun, gameplay, and creativity. The only thing really keeping this game from being higher on the list is that Joustus isn't anywhere near as fun as the regular platforming. I recognize that it can be skipped entirely, but I felt that my experience with the game would have been incomplete without tackling it, so I trudged through what were fun but undeniably more tedious challenges. Even so, King of Cards was a very worthy way to close things out for the Shovel Knight saga. Number 9. Clubhouse Games. I was intrigued by this game when I first heard about it, but I am shocked that I have gotten as much out of it as I have. Logging in over 100 hours of total gameplay between my in-laws, wife, and myself, this well-made collection of internationally sourced board, card, and parlor games practically has infinite replay value. While not all of the included games are as fun as their real-life versions, or just not fun altogether, some games like Chess, Ludo, President, as well as Hit and Blow have kept me coming back repeatedly, and I imagine that the amount of time I have already spent on Clubhouse Games will simply continue to grow, since it is the epitome of a pick-up-and-go kind of experience, providing relaxing entertainment value when I need a quick and suitable fix for my boredom. You might not find this to be as exciting as other games released in 2020, but it's very fun to play, and that is ultimately where things count. Number 8. Donkey Kong Country. In a way, I feel as though I may have cheated a bit with this one. I do sincerely think Donkey Kong Country is a great game and more than deserves the positive attention it has and will continue to engender. However, many of my generation tried and failed to complete this game without losing their extra lives, whereas I breezed through it with the help of the Switch Online Rewind feature. Therefore, I'll probably have to play Donkey Kong Country again at some point in order to gauge how I truly feel about it. That being said, for the time I did spend playing it, I can sincerely say that this was yet another bona fide classic from Rare in a decade when they were one of the most consistent developers in the industry in terms of quality. There was some wickedly entertaining 2D platforming to behold here, and I'm eager to try out the other Donkey Kong Country games as well. Number 7. Downwell. I didn't think I would be into roguelikes until I gave Downwell a try, and had an absolute blast with it. Even though I still technically haven't completely beaten this game, I've logged enough hours to confidently say that it is an exhilarating experience. And sure, looking at this footage you may not think that, but the deceptively simple look of this retro-styled indie game hides the fact that each randomly generated stage is extremely fast-paced and frenetic. In these stages, you play a character whose objective is to simply fall down a perpetually bottomless pit, and you gain benefits from either bouncing on top of various enemies or shooting them with your literal gun boots. Each time you bounce on an enemy or land on the ground, you reload said boots, but the game incentivizes you to bounce on as many of these enemies as possible without touching the ground by offering greater rewards for doing so, meaning that each run encourages you to play smart and with quick reflexes. I find games like that to be both challenging and very fun, so despite its simplicity and limited scope, Downwell was one of the most entertaining games I played in 2020. Number 6.
Superhot.
First-person shooters are sort of like the superhero movies of the gaming industry. They're a dime a dozen these days, particularly the generic military shooters which are made just for satisfying shareholders. But then something like Superhot comes around and completely reinvigorates the genre. In this case, the game not only stands out from its competition because of its polygonal art design and minimal colors, I mean, that's a big reason, but more so because of the gameplay. The concept is that in this universe, time only moves when you do, meaning that gunplay and maneuvering one's surroundings is more about solving a puzzle than clearing a room guns blazing. But solving such a puzzle is not the limit of one's capabilities in the game, for it is just as satisfying to eliminate a bunch of red dudes in the same way that Neo and friends wasted guys in the Matrix. If you want something truly unique from an FPS game, look no further than Superhot, which is the most innovative shooter I've played in years. Number 5. The Ori games. Very rarely do platforming games have a compelling narrative. It's even rarer still that such games will cause me to feel something, and that was my experience with both 2015's Ori and the Blind Forest, as well as Ori and the Will of the Wisps, which came out last March. These games have not a single line of spoken dialogue, and yet their storylines elicited stronger emotional responses from me than most movies, games, and other types of media ever do. This is helped by the fact that these are otherwise very well-made Metroidvanias with absolutely absolutely gorgeous artwork, euphoric music composed by Gareth Coker that I still listen to on a regular basis, on top of game design that feel less like levels and more like actual organic worlds that could exist somewhere. I have a few gripes with the controls and gameplay, the likes of which differ between the two titles, but otherwise, these are games that have actually grown on me the more I've thought about them. I would love to play through them again, and if you own an Xbox or Nintendo Switch or PC, these are must-own games. Number 4. Doom and Doom Eternal. Sometimes you just need to let loose your anger and frustration, but rather than lashing out at friends and family in real life or on social media, why not just play Doom 2016 or its superb sequel Doom Eternal? After all, these games allow you to unleash all of your bottled up fury by stepping into the shoes of the Doomslayer, who righteously uses bullets to turn demons into piles of blood, guts, and body parts. Playing these two titles back to back was one of the most cathartic experiences I have ever had with video games, since that intensely gratifying first-person shooter combat was not only fun, it also came into my life at the exact moment I needed it. The practically perfect single-player campaigns for both of these games, between the well-designed levels, tongue-in-cheek writing, Mick Gordon's incredible music, and of course the empowering gunplay, all culminated in the escape I thankfully relished in due to some personal hardship I was going through at the time. Despite these being among my favorite first-person shooters though, and Doom Eternal itself receiving an A+ in my review, I rank them at number 4 because I nonetheless had an incomplete experience with them. Thus far, I've only experienced the single-player campaigns, and likely will never invest any time in multiplayer. That being said, these games are absolutely worth checking out if you need some video game-induced adrenaline. Number 3. Cuphead. You know what? Forget what I just said seconds ago. If you really want a game to get your blood pumping, then try Cuphead on for size. It may not appear to be that hardcore of an experience from first glance, but don't let the old-fashioned cartoony aesthetic throw you off, because this is one seriously tough game. And I really mean tough, for I originally started playing it when it first debuted on the Switch back in April 2019, but then put it off due to thinking that it was practically unbeatable. When Cuphead himself was announced as a surprising addition to the roster of purchasable Mii fighter costumes in Smash Ultimate about a year ago, I then realized that it was time to finally finish the game, and boy was I reminded of how truly magnificent this independently produced run-and-gun platformer really is. And yeah, as an animation nut, I absolutely adore the hand-drawn, yes, hand-drawn animation and catchy big band soundtrack, but can we talk about how satisfying it is just as a game? The 20 or so boss fights and occasional run-and-gun levels are legitimate challenges, but all of them are balanced to be fair for the player, and on top of that, the player who is patient enough to learn from their mistakes and keep on trying. Since the controls are smooth and the combat simple but addictive, I gladly accepted the challenges the game kept throwing at me, and I was happy to keep on progressing, having a blast with all of the truly unique encounters that I can still vividly remember in my head. This game can basically be summed up by referring to that horrible Reddit post EA submitted to justify the obnoxious grind for heroes and villains in Battlefront 2, except when they're referring to players feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment that is actually truthful when it comes to Cuphead. The time and energy needed to competently fight the bosses is honestly worth every second of it, because these fights are absolutely exhilarating and can still be immensely fun even after trying to beat them repeatedly over the course of a couple of hours. Despite what others may have told you about the ungodly difficulty of this game, please do consider playing it regardless of whatever reservations it may have, because rarely have I played a video game that feels as rewarding to beat as this one was. Number 2. Ghost of Tsushima. I am fully aware that this game is somewhat looked down upon by some people for it being yet another AAA open-world game that falls back on Ubisoft-like tendencies of copied and pasted side missions and whatnot. And yeah, Ghost of Tsushima does those things for sure, but the final major exclusive for the PS4 implements those things so seamlessly and effectively that I honestly couldn't care less. This epic samurai tale is exactly how I would hope games like Assassin's Creed would turn out. It does all of those open-world things you expect, delivering them in such a way that the gameplay loop is not a drawn-out series of distractions and recycled side missions, but rather contributing to an immersive adventure that naturally ties into each other. In what is essentially Batman's origin story re-envisioned in late 1200s Japan, the ultimate outcome may be the same no matter what you do, but what I truly loved about this game is that I felt like my actions in the gameplay really mattered. As the self-sworn avenger of Tsushima, an island viciously raided by the Mongols, you take it upon yourself as Jin Sakai to repel that invasion and bring peace and order back to an oppressed land. Characters will frequently reference your heroic, if perhaps morally questionable deeds, and the story itself left a legitimate emotional impact on me due to how much the gameplay kept me engaged, making it truly register with me that I, not Jin, created the hero that Tsushima deserved. Thankfully though, the depressing tone of the story did not overpower the core gameplay, which featured very fluid combat, a great sense of exploration, and a combination of both story-based and side missions that were mostly very enjoyable. I absolutely adored this game aside from its minor quirks, and was my favorite game of 2020 for quite a while. But then another game showed up that took me completely by surprise. I never reviewed this game on this channel, but it's one that I wish I did because not only is it my favorite game of 2020, it is now among my favorite games of all time. Ladies and gentlemen, that game is Hades. Earlier on in 2020, my brother had been pestering me to play this, and as someone whose only previous experience with a roguelike was the aforementioned Downwell, I was unsure. Eventually he just straight up bought it for me, so I gave it a shot. I have to admit though that it took me a little while to become invested in the game. In a nutshell, the story is all about the son of Hades, Zagreus, trying to escape the underworld. Every single run through of the game is another one of his attempts to get out of his literally hellish existence, and each time that you die, you're sent all the way back to the house of Hades where you need to start all over again. The catch is that on each new run you start, the dungeon rooms arrange themselves in a different order, meaning that you won't get the same experience twice. What was discouraging about this is that each time I started over, I hoped for a better outcome, only to die. A lot. But here's the thing, over time the game steadily hooked me, and suddenly this drive to succeed was internalized within me. Each time I thought, okay, maybe I'll get there this time, or at least I might get a lot further than where I was before, and that's what happened. I kept on going at it, and each time I would learn more about the bosses, what combat strategies work best, and I would earn rewards that carried over and allowed me to upgrade my abilities and weapons. Moreover, the game provides almost constant gratification and rewards, meaning that even when you may lose, you still earn something that helps you progress in the game overall or in a single run. But perhaps the best thing of all is that the story and gameplay are 100% in sync with each other. The well-written and lively characters both among the underworld and Olympian gods kept me completely locked into the events of the story because like in Ghost of Tsushima, they would always comment on things I did in the game and had genuine conversations with me based on how much I had progressed. There was not a single repeated line of dialogue in this game, and it's honestly kind of insane how intricate the storyline revealed itself to be, as I completed more runs, got to know the characters more, and got further in Zagreus' personal journey. It's ultimately a wonderful, immaculately detailed, and very addictive action RPG that pushes the limits of what's possible through gameplay-driven storytelling. If you own a Switch or have Steam, play this as soon as you possibly can. One of the most gratifying experiences you could ever have with a video game awaits you. And that's it. There were other games that started in 2020, but these were the ones I played thoroughly enough to include on my list. Making this video was fun though, so I'll look forward to doing it again next year. If you liked this and would be eager to see more, please feel free to subscribe to my channel and join the notification squadron so that you don't miss out on my future videos. Thank you very much for watching, and keep on gaming!